The church was full. White flowers aligned along the aisle exhaled a sweet fragrance. The guests murmured in expectation, and she, Emily, trembled before the altar in the immaculate dress that seemed not to fit her soul. The groom, Michael, wore a rehearsed smile, but his cold eyes betrayed something dark that no one dared to question. And when the pastor asked if anyone was against that marriage, a thunderous laugh broke the silence, coming from the back of the hall, making everyone turn in. Astonishment, and it was at that instant that Emily felt her world was about to collapse. But before I continue, I need you to subscribe to the channel right now, because stories like this, intense, real and emotional, are published here every day, and I don't want you to miss the next ending that could change the way you see life forever. The laughter came from a tall woman, her eyes burning with fury, dressed in red that clashed with the solemnity of the ceremony, and she walked slowly down the aisle, each step echoing like hammer blows in Emily's heart, whose hands sweated inside her lace gloves. No one understood what was happening, but whispers grew like a wildfire, spreading uncontrollably, and Michael, once confident, turned pale, trying to stop the approach of that stranger who, however, seemed to know every secret hidden beneath the perfect mask of that marriage that now no longer seemed a union, but a sentence. Emily, motionless before the altar, longed to scream, to run, to vanish, but the same force that had kept her standing for so many years under silent humiliations now prevented her from reacting, because something inside whispered that this moment was inevitable, that this unknown woman carried with her a truth that would change not only the course of the ceremony, but her entire existence. And the guests' eyes, once full of tenderness, were now blades of judgment, piercing her skin, wounding her soul, leaving her exposed, naked, as if every scar from her past had been torn open and displayed mercilessly before them all. The woman in red stopped a few steps from the altar, raised her arm and pointed directly at Michael, accusing him with a firm voice, charged with hatred and pain. He does not deserve this marriage, because he has already destroyed other lives, including mine. And that cry echoed through the church like thunder, shattering the silence that until then sustained the ceremony, even making the pastor falter in his words. And Emily, still not fully understanding, felt a stab in her chest, because suddenly, all the love she believed to be true was turning into a wall of doubts, so high it suffocated any hope that still remained. The guests began to rise, some trying to console Emily, others murmuring cruel judgments that made her feel like a tragic spectacle, and Michael, desperate, tried to restrain the woman, but every word from him seemed like another poorly rehearsed lie, and Emily realized there was no turning back, because that scene, so public, so devastating, had torn off the mask of a marriage that in truth had never existed in essence, but only in the image he upheld to impress society and hide his shadows. The woman, now weeping, revealed before everyone that she had been Michael's mistress, that he had abandoned her pregnant years ago, leaving her to her own fate, and that she was only there because she could not bear to see yet another innocent woman deceived by his carefully constructed charade. Emily felt her body tremble, her breath falter, and the wedding dress, once a symbol of purity, now felt like a suffocating prison. And in that instant she asked herself how she had come so far without seeing the obvious, how she could have given her life to someone who hid so much darkness behind such convincing smiles. The pastor, stunned, tried to regain control, asking for silence, but chaos had already set in, and Emily felt that her story was being written right there, not as a celebration, but as a drama tearing out tears and fury. And what hurt her most was realizing that, among so many witnesses, no one really knew the depth of the pain she carried, because that moment was not just about Michael and his lie, but about all the times she had been humiliated in silence, scorned, invisible, as if her life had no value at all. And then, at the height of despair, with tears smearing her makeup and her heart in flames, Emily felt inside her an unknown strength, a courage born from the abyss, and she lifted her head, stared at Michael before everyone, and, with a trembling but resolute voice, said she also had something to reveal, a secret she had kept for years, and that would change not only his life, but the life of everyone present in that church. And this moment turned silence into expectation, because no one dared breathe. All waited for what Emily, the humiliated bride, was about to confess. Emily kept her eyes fixed on Michael, but in her chest a war raged. Between the love she thought she felt and the hatred that now consumed her before the brutal exposure of truth, the dress weighed as if made of iron, and the flowers around her, once sweet, now reeked of rot, reminding her that that wedding had never been about her, but about the image Michael wanted to display. And when the woman in red stopped, all eyes turned to Emily, as if expecting from her an immediate reaction. Collapse, a scream, or perhaps an impossible forgiveness. But the silence she chose sustained the suspense in the air, making it clear that something even greater was about to be revealed, because within her grew a truth kept for years, suffocated in her throat, waiting for the moment to explode. Michael tried to regain control, walked up to Emily and gripped her hand tightly, forcing a nervous smile, muttering that it was all just an act, a lie invented by someone obsessed with destroying him, and his eyes pleaded for her trust. But the words sounded hollow, cold, like shards of glass falling to the floor, because there was no longer room to believe in improvised justifications. And Emily realized she did not know the man beside her, did not know his secrets, nor his shadows. She had only loved a carefully constructed illusion, and this realization tore her chest apart, as if all the wasted time, every dream nurtured, had turned into dust before an audience that was now witness to her ruin. The woman in red, crying and laughing at the same time, raised a crumpled photograph she held in her hands, an old picture of herself with a small baby, and shouted that Michael was the father of that child, whom he never acknowledged nor helped, abandoning her to live a life of lies with other women. And the scandal spread through the church like fire on dry straw, the guests murmuring with outrage, some rising to leave, others stepping closer not to miss a single detail of the tragic spectacle unfolding before their hungry eyes. And Emily felt the force of the words like invisible daggers, each revelation driving deeper into the wound of her soul. Michael, in despair, tried to snatch the photograph from the woman's hand, but she held firm, shouting louder that she would not be silenced, that she would not return to the darkness of oblivion, that she would make sure everyone saw who he really was. And the guests began recording the scene on their cell phones, capturing not a wedding but the public downfall of a man who for so long had hidden behind the image of a successful professional and exemplary groom. And Emily realized that in that moment, her private life no longer existed, because her humiliation was now recorded forever, ready to be consumed as cruel entertainment. Emily took a deep breath, her heart beating like a drum, and for the first time since entering the church, she let go of Michael's hand, taking 2 steps back, creating a distance that felt like an abyss between them. And with that, the audience understood that the bond had been broken, that there was no return for that relationship. But Emily knew she had to go further, had to take the floor, had to reclaim control of her own story. And when she raised her voice, still trembling but clear, everyone immediately fell silent, because in that instant the humiliated bride became the narrator of her own destiny, preparing to reveal something that could change not only Michael's image, but the meaning of the entire ruined ceremony. The silence was so heavy that the muffled sobs of some women in the back pews could be heard, and Emily felt that the moment of liberation had come, even if it cost her her last strength, even if it stripped her of any mask she still wore. And she looked directly at the woman in red, recognizing in her a pain that was also hers, because both had been deceived, both had been invisible. Both had been discarded like pieces in a cruel game that Michael always knew how to play, and that unexpected connection strengthened her because she understood that she was not alone, that her pain was shared, that solidarity existed even in the most brutal of circumstances. Michael tried to interrupt, stepping in front of her, but Emily stepped back, raised her hand asking for space, and her eyes burned with fire. Her voice, though trembling, grew firm. "You think you know the truth, but I also have something that no one here imagines." And when she spoke those words, the tension spread through the hall like electricity, every guest holding their breath, cell phones raised, ready to capture the revelation, and Michael, gripped by panic, whispered for her not to say anything, but it was too late, because the moment Emily had waited for her entire life had finally arrived. The instant to transform her pain into voice. And then, with tears streaming down her face and her dress stained with pollen fallen from flowers crushed by the chaos, Emily declared that she was not as innocent as everyone thought, that her life hid a dark truth, that years ago she had made a decision that changed the course of everything, and that this secret could destroy not only Michael, but the very destiny of many people present in that church. And the entire congregation plunged into an even deeper silence, as if the air had become too heavy to breathe, because everyone knew that what was about to be revealed was not just another lie exposed, but a fatal blow that would forever alter the course of that story. Emily took a deep breath and, with trembling hands, grabbed the microphone still at the pastor's pulpit, as if that object were the only anchor capable of sustaining her in that moment of chaos, and her voice, though choked, echoed clear through the church. "You need to know, I am not just the victim in this story. Because years ago, when I was still searching for meaning in my life, I met Michael. But he was not the first man who deceived me, and because of another, I made a decision that still tears me apart. I had a child, and no one here knows that this child is no longer alive because I lost him in circumstances that still haunt me to this day." And in that instant, a collective gasp swept through the church, the once judging eyes now filled with shock and compassion, and Michael, terrified, put his hands to his face, because he understood that this secret was greater than any lie he had tried to conceal. Tears ran heavily, smearing Emily's makeup, but she continued, her voice firm, even though her heart seemed to shatter with every word. "I was a mother for only a few months, and I lost that baby because I was abandoned when I needed help the most. Left alone in a cold hospital room, with no one to hold my hand. And since that day I have carried a guilt I have never been able to forgive myself for, because I believed I failed as a woman, as a mother, as a person." And each sentence struck the congregation like invisible hammers, pulling tears from guests who before had only murmured, but now felt the weight of a pain so deep that it was impossible not to be moved. And Emily, fragile and at the same time immense, turned her confession into an act of courage before everyone. The woman in red, who until then had seemed consumed by hatred, lowered her eyes and began to cry as well, because she recognized in that story an echo of her own pain. And for the first time since entering that church, she ceased to be the accuser and became a witness to the truth. And the guests, who once looked at her with disdain, now saw her as part of a cruel fate that bound two women scarred by rejection and abandonment. Two different stories entwined at a common point. Michael, the man who had deceived them, but also life itself, which had stolen their dreams, leaving open scars. Michael, desperate, tried to interrupt again, shouting that it was unnecessary, that innocent lives were being destroyed. But his words carried no weight anymore, no credibility, because everyone saw in his gestures only the panic of a man who knew the mask had finally fallen. And the pastor, not knowing what to do, simply bowed his head, murmuring an almost inaudible prayer, as if asking for strength to endure the truth laid bare before them all. And Emily, breathing fast, lifted her tear-filled eyes and said, "This secret has always haunted me. But today I realize I can no longer live hidden. Because life is not made of appearances, it is made of truths, even when they hurt." The silence in the church became suffocating, and then Emily took a step forward, approaching the woman in red, facing her with unexpected tenderness, and holding her hands, confessed, "I know what it is to be left behind. I know what it is to feel worthless. I too was betrayed, abandoned, and forgotten, and if today we are here, it is because somehow our pains needed to meet so that the truth could come to light." And that simple gesture, two women united in tears at the altar of a ruined wedding, became a scene laden with symbolic power, wrenching sobs from those who watched, because it was impossible not to feel the strength of that unlikely union, born in the midst of chaos. Michael, now completely cornered, looked around seeking support, but found only stares of condemnation, and for the first time his body trembled, because he realized he had lost everything. Not just Emily, not just his reputation, but the trust of every person present, and that made him small, fragile, a man stripped of all the power he thought he had, reduced to someone ordinary, flawed, ridiculous before public judgment. And Emily, seeing his fall, felt no vengeance, but a strange sensation of freedom, as if she had finally lifted from her shoulders a weight that had been crushing her for years. But she knew it was still not the end, because there was something more, something that could not remain hidden, and with a faint voice she faced them all and said, "I never told anyone, but the truth is that the baby I lost was not just the result of a failed relationship. He was the result of a mistake, of a lie that also involved Michael, even if he never knew it." And suddenly the tension began to rise again, because now it was no longer just a personal tragedy. It was a direct link tying her pain to the man who was about to become her husband. And the guests held their breath once more, waiting for the revelation that could change everything. Emily wiped her tears, took a deep breath, and concluded, letting her voice echo like thunder within the church, "The child I lost was Michael's, and he never knew. Because when I discovered the pregnancy, I had already heard rumors of his betrayal. I already knew he was not a trustworthy man, and even so I tried to believe, I tried to fight. But when I lost the child, I decided to keep the secret, because I couldn't bear to be just another woman deceived in his life. And today, before all of you, I deliver this truth, because I can no longer carry this pain alone." And the shock that spread through the church was so intense that it felt as if the ground had trembled. The gasps, the muffled cries and tears now filled the air, transforming that wedding into an unforgettable scene, engraved forever in everyone's memory. Before continuing her revelation, Emily took another breath, feeling all eyes nailed to her skin, as if every word she spoke were being carved in fire into the hearts of those witnesses. And in that instant, her voice trembled as she said, "If you have made it this far, it's because you feel the weight of this story as much as I do, and I need to ask you something. Subscribe now to this channel, because each narrative here is made to touch your soul, to open your eyes, and you cannot miss what is still to come, because what will happen in this story will surprise you even more." And that request did not sound like advertising, but like an intimate confession, a sincere invitation to remain until the very last second, because Emily's revelation was only just beginning, and everyone knew there were still more layers to be unveiled in that tragedy exposed on a sacred altar. The heavy silence of the church was broken by a scream from Michael, who, overtaken by fury, lunged at Emily, gripping her shoulders and shaking her in desperation, shouting that it was a lie, that she had invented everything to destroy him, that it was just another attempt at manipulation. But his eyes, full of fear, betrayed him. His fractured voice lacked the solidity of one who speaks the truth, and the people present noticed this immediately, stepping away from him, murmuring insults, and some even shouted for him to leave her alone, because there was no longer any doubt that the man was lost in his own web of lies, and Emily, though shaken, found the strength to break free, stepping back firmly and saying, "You can deny it, Michael, but deep down you know I would never invent something like this." The woman in red, still standing among the guests, raised her voice again, but now no longer with fury, instead with tears streaming down, because she herself was in shock with the revelation. "So it wasn't just me. I wasn't the only one. He destroyed more lives than I can count. And you, Emily, even without knowing, carried within you the same pain I carried, because we both were victims of the same man." And her words echoed like a collective lament, breaking the last resistances still clinging to some hearts, uniting the two women in a kind of sisterhood forged in pain, before an audience that wept not only for the tragedy of others, but because many saw in their stories reflections of their own hidden scars. Michael, his face drenched in sweat, tried to defend himself, walking up to the pastor and demanding that the ceremony continue, that everything be forgotten, that the woman in red be expelled and Emily silenced. But the pastor, trembling, only shook his head, because at that moment there was no way to pretend nothing had happened. There was no blessing that could erase so many revelations, and with a broken voice, the man of God declared that he could not unite two hearts stained by lies, that the altar was not a stage for deceit. And this statement was like the final shovel of dirt closing the grave over Michael's hopes, who staggered, mumbling incoherent words, feeling surrounded on all sides. Emily, amid the chaos, raised her voice again, and this time she did not speak only to Michael but to everyone. "I kept this secret because I was afraid. Afraid of being judged, afraid of never being loved again, afraid of looking in the mirror and seeing no worth. But today I realize there is nothing more liberating than tearing off the mask, than living without hiding the pain, because silence does not heal, silence kills. And I refuse to die alive again." And those words pierced the hearts of the audience like sharp blades, but at the same time like balm, because many understood that this was not just Emily's story. It was the story of thousands who had kept silent before their own pain, and now saw in her a voice daring to speak. And in that instant some guests began to applaud quietly, not in celebration, but in respect, as if they were witnessing an act of bravery that deserved to be honored, a gesture that went beyond the walls of the church, and touched something eternal in the human heart. The atmosphere intensified even more when one of the guests, an elderly man seated in the front row, stood up and said loudly, "I know this story. I knew about that baby. I worked at the hospital that night." And shock spread through the hall, because no one expected anyone to confirm the details, but the old man, with trembling hands, explained that he remembered Emily crying alone, remembered the anguish in her eyes, remembered that she had held the small lifeless body for hours, and that the scene had marked his memory forever. And suddenly Emily's pain became not just confession, but testimonial truth, undeniable before everyone. And as the old man spoke, More tears slid down the faces present. Because it was no longer possible to deny that the tragedy had been real, had been cruel, and had left deep scars not only in the bride, but in all those who now witnessed her liberation. Michael, now completely undone, collapsed to his knees in the middle of the church aisle, clutching his hair, screaming that he did not deserve that judgment, that he could not be punished that way. But people began to move away from him as one avoids something impure, as one avoids being contaminated by lies, and Emily, though shattered, felt something inside her blossom for the first time. The sensation that she was no longer a prisoner of a secret, that she had finally freed her soul, even at the cost of the ruin of a wedding and the public exposure of her most intimate pain. And while the groom fell into despair, she remained standing, a symbol of resistance, as if life itself had chosen to transform her, before the eyes of all, from victim to survivor, from shadow to light. And that contrast made it clear that, on that day, there was more than a failed ceremony. There was a rebirth. And when silence once again filled the church, Emily lifted her eyes to the colored stained glass illuminated by the morning light and whispered, more to herself than to the others, "I am no longer the same. I am not the humiliated bride. I am someone who survived abandonment, loss, and lies, and I am still standing." And those words echoed with such strength that many felt they were not just witnessing a disaster, but a rebirth, a milestone in the life of a woman who chose truth over appearances, courage over silence, and freedom over the invisible prison that had bound her for years. And at that instant an elderly woman, who until then had remained silent, stood up and murmured through sobs, "She did not fall, she resurrected." And that phrase crossed the space like a seal, like the final piece of a mosaic of pain and hope, fixing in everyone the certainty that they had witnessed something far greater than a scandal. They had witnessed the revelation of human strength in its purest form. Emily was still standing before the altar, but she was no longer the same woman who had entered wearing the white dress carrying a dream, but someone who rose from the ashes of a lifetime of hidden pain. And when she looked at the guests, she saw tears streaming down faces that once only judged. She saw tear-filled eyes of people who identified with her suffering, and she felt that for the first time in years she was not alone, because the burden she carried had been shared, and the divided weight had become bearable, and her voice, though tired, echoed through the space. "I don't want to live in silence anymore. I don't want to be a prisoner of secrets anymore." And those words, so simple and direct, sounded like a manifesto reverberating beyond the church, as if addressed to the heart of every spectator who would hear that story, because there was something universal in her confession, something that touched old wounds hidden in the audience. Michael, still on his knees on the floor, looked up with red, pleading eyes, as if searching for some trace of compassion, and he reached out to Emily, begging her to forgive him, to give him a chance, to remember the good moments they had shared. But his words sounded weak, empty, like the echoes of a man who had already lost everything. And the audience showed no support, only stares of reproach, and Emily, breathing heavily, stepped closer, but not to console him, rather to say, "I forgave you, Michael, but not for you. I forgave for myself, because I don't want your shadow living in my heart anymore." And that phrase was like a final sentence, not of vengeance, but of liberation, drawing spontaneous applause from some guests who could no longer contain their emotion in the face of the courage they were witnessing. The woman in red, moved to tears, approached Emily and in an unexpected gesture, embraced her tightly, as if two shattered souls had finally found refuge in one another. And that embrace, in the middle of the church in emotional ruins, was more powerful than any sermon, more eloquent than any word, because there stood two women who had been betrayed, but who in that instant were no longer rivals, no longer discarded pieces of a cruel game, but survivors, witnesses of their own strength. And the onlookers wept even more, because they saw that the true victory did not lie in destroying Michael, but in finding themselves within the pain. The pastor, who until then had remained silent, went back up to the pulpit, with a choked voice and tearful eyes, and said, "Today this ceremony did not become a wedding, but it became a testimony. A testimony that truth always comes to light, that pain can be transformed into strength, and that God does not dwell in appearances, but in sincere hearts." And his words echoed like a hymn of hope in the midst of tragedy, bringing an air of spirituality that made many of the guests kneel and pray in silence, not only for Emily, but for themselves, because each one carried within hidden wounds that, in some way, had been touched by that public revelation. Emily, still overwhelmed by the embrace of the woman in red, lifted her eyes and said, "We were both deceived, but today I choose not to be a victim anymore. I choose to be someone who writes her own story." And in that moment she held the other woman's hand, raising it before everyone, and that symbolic gesture was received with a mix of surprise and respect, for no one expected two wounds to transform into such a powerful collective strength, and the audience, in tears, understood that they were witnessing a historic moment, something that was not merely an individual drama, but an act that represented all the women and men who had ever been betrayed, deceived, and silenced, and upon that altar, suffering was transformed into a banner. Meanwhile, Michael, defeated, still tried to justify himself, shouting that all of it was unfair, that he could not be judged that way, but his words no longer reached anyone. They echoed like noises from a past that had no power anymore, and some guests even told him to be silent, for there was no longer space for lies there, and he, shrinking, realized he had lost not only Emily, not only his reputation, but he had lost the chance to be remembered with dignity, and his name would now forever be marked by shame, while Emily's image would be engraved as a symbol of strength. The old man who had confirmed the story approached Emily and held her hands tenderly, saying, "I never forgot what I saw in that hospital, but today, seeing you standing here, I feel that life has given you back something. Given you back the dignity that seemed lost." And Emily, in tears, thanked him with a fragile smile, because she knew that recognition was more than a gesture. It was the validation that her pain had not been in vain, that even in the darkest moment, there had been someone who had witnessed and remembered her, and that made her feel her story was not being buried, but rewritten before everyone. The atmosphere was one of collective emotion, and Emily, no longer able to bear so many feelings, knelt before the altar, not to join Michael, but to silently give thanks for the courage she had found. And in her heart she prayed a wordless prayer, asking not only for strength to continue, but that her life from that day on would be different, free from the invisible chains of shame and fear. And when she lifted her face, her eyes shone not with sadness, but with hope, as if she had found a new version of herself, ready to begin again even after so many losses. And so, before everyone, Emily rose slowly, lifted her chin and walked toward the exit of the church, with firm steps and steady gaze, while the guests moved aside, opening a path as if they were witnessing not the departure of a defeated bride, but the march of a heroine who had won her greatest battle. And in that instant all understood that the day would not be remembered for a ruined wedding, but for the strength of a woman who had turned humiliation into liberation, silence into voice, and loss into rebirth, leaving behind not only a fallen man, but an old version of herself. And the audience, in tears, knew they would never forget that moment, because they had not witnessed just a drama, but the miracle of courage. As she left the church, Emily felt the cold afternoon wind strike her tear-stained face, and for the first time in a long while, she breathed deeply without feeling as though the air tore through her lungs, walking slowly down the street while the guests followed her with stunned gazes, not knowing whether to console her or simply respect her solitude, and each step was heavy, yet also carried an invisible lightness, as if she were stepping out of a prison built by years of secrets. And the world around her seemed more alive, sharper, the sky bluer, the ground firmer, as though reality itself were rebuilding around her. And although the sounds of conversations behind her were full of shock, whispers, and laments, Emily did not look back, because she knew that moment was not about the past, but about a silent new beginning opening before her feet. Some guests, moved, tried to approach, to offer comfort and embrace words of support, but Emily raised her hand gently, asking them to let her continue alone. And that gesture was not rejection, but affirmation, because for the first time she wanted to experience the feeling of standing on her own, without depending on glances or hands to lift her. And as she passed through the church doors, she saw that some women were watching her with tears in their eyes, as if they had seen themselves reflected in her courage. And in that moment she realized that, without planning it, she had become a symbol, not because she desired applause or titles, but because she had shown before everyone that it is possible to turn pain into strength, shame into liberation. And her story was no longer just her own, but of every person who, upon witnessing it, would feel their own heart laid bare. Outside, the city seemed indifferent to the chaos that had unfolded inside the church. People hurried by, cars sped along, birds flew unaware of the human drama unraveling, and Emily, sitting on the steps, stared at that contrast, feeling at once small and infinite, because though her life seemed to have collapsed before everyone, the world still kept turning, and this made her understand that her pain, however intense, was not the end, but part of a much greater story, and it was there in that strange silence that she realized she no longer needed to hide, that she could allow herself to be fragile and still go on, because life would not wait for her to be ready, but she could walk even with open scars, and that thought, however painful, was also liberating. The woman in red, whose name everyone now knew to be Clara, came out right after her, hesitant, as if unsure whether her presence would be welcome, but determined not to leave her alone, and sat a few steps below in silence, without looking directly, merely offering the company of someone who understands without words. And that simple gesture was more valuable to Emily than any speech, because deep down, both were survivors of the same lie, of the same man who had built castles of illusion and toppled them without mercy. And in that shared quietude, an unexpected bond arose between them, not of rivalry, but of sisterhood, and the glances they exchanged, brief and discreet, were filled with recognition, respect, a silent promise that from then on, neither would have to face life's storms alone. Then, a black car stopped in front of the church, and out stepped a figure no one expected to see. A middle-aged man, with a heavy expression and eyes fixed on Emily, walking firmly up to where she sat. And when he stopped before her, silence took over the place, because everyone felt there was something different about his presence, and Emily, confused, asked with a trembling voice who he was, and the man, after a few seconds of hesitation, revealed something that made the ground vanish beneath her feet. "I am your father." And those 3 words, simple and dry, fell upon her heart like an avalanche, because all her life she had believed he was dead. And suddenly there he was, in the flesh, before her tear-filled eyes, changing the course of the story irreversibly. Emily's legs trembled, her whole body seemed to reject the revelation, because it was impossible to accept that the man who had abandoned her mother when she was still a child, who had never sent word, who had never reached out, was standing there of all days, on this day of ruin and rebuilding, and she, with a choked voice almost screaming, asked, "Why? Why now? Why appear after a lifetime of silence?" And the man, with tears in his eyes, replied, "Because only today did I find the courage, and because I discovered the secret Michael was hiding from you. The secret that could have changed everything." And in that instant, the pain of betrayal mixed with unbearable curiosity, because Emily, even against her will, felt she needed to hear, needed to understand what was still to come. Clara, witnessing the scene, placed her hand on Emily's shoulder, trying to convey some strength, but she too was in shock, because she realized the story was far from over, and the man continued, "Michael knew about my existence. He knew I was alive, but did everything to keep the truth from you, because he feared losing control over your life." And that revelation was like another knife thrust into Emily's chest, because the betrayal was not merely conjugal, it was deeper, existential, and she realized the ruined wedding had only been the surface of an ocean of lies that needed to be revealed, and her heart beat erratically, as if there were not enough air to sustain that avalanche of discoveries. And when all thought the weight of the revelations was already unbearable, the man, with a firm and resolute voice, said the phrase that would change not only that afternoon, but Emily's entire life. "Michael not only deceived you with betrayals. He kept a secret about your very identity, something that could destroy everything he built, something that will give you answers you have waited for your whole life." And the silence that followed was absolute, for no one dared to breathe. Everyone knew they were standing before the opening of a new chapter, an abyss even deeper about to be unveiled, and Emily, tears streaming and hands trembling, could only murmur, tell me now," preparing herself, though in pieces, for the truth that was about to change everything again. The man drew a deep breath, bearing the weight of decades of silence and regret, and began to speak with a firm yet trembling voice, revealing that Michael, the man who had destroyed Emily's marriage and trust, was not just an ordinary traitor, but an impostor who had assumed a stolen identity to hide crimes from the past, and that, all those years, he manipulated people, documents, and hearts as if they were disposable pieces in a macabre game. And Emily, listening, felt the ground vanish beneath her feet again, as if she were being thrown into an abyss of lies even deeper than she imagined, because the life she had known was only a mask of hidden truths, and each memory now bore a layer of doubt and horror, and all of it turned her pain into something far more complex, something that spanned generations and untold traumas. She tried to process it, but each word seemed to echo inside her head like hammer blows, and when she looked at Clara, she saw the same shock, the same disbelief imprinted on her silent friend's face, because the secret was not only about Michael, but about Emily. She was the rightful heir to a fortune the impostor had tried to erase from history, a fortune tied to a powerful family that had vanished from public memory decades ago. And her birth had been hidden to ensure Michael could control her life and everything around her, and the weight of that revelation crushed not only her heart, but her very sense of identity, because Emily now saw herself reflected in a distorted mirror of lies, not knowing who she truly was, and desperately needing to rebuild her story from fragments of a stolen past. The silence among the three was almost suffocating, broken only by the wind sweeping across the church steps and the distant footsteps of guests still watching from afar, unable to fully grasp what was happening. And Emily felt a mixture of fear and fury grow within her, because knowing her whole life had been manipulated was devastating, yet it also awakened in her a silent, fierce determination to claim her right to truth, to her name, to her own story. And the man who was her father continued explaining that he had tried to contact Michael countless times, threatening to expose the truth, but had always been blocked, ignored, or even threatened, and that finally, only at that moment, had he found the courage to appear before her, so that Emily could know the reality before the imposter had another chance to manipulate the cards of fate. She tried to speak, but the words refused to come out. The world was spinning too fast, and every memory of Michael now blended with what she had just discovered, and she realized that every gesture, every broken promise, every lie told, was part of a much larger plan, and that her own life had been a silent battle between forces she had never understood, but which now stood before her eyes, exposed and unavoidable. And Clara, perceiving the intensity of the revelation, held Emily's hand firmly, transmitting courage and support, reminding her that, even in the epicenter of betrayal and manipulation, there was someone willing to face the abyss alongside her. As Emily absorbed everything, the man revealed the final blow that Michael had planned, the attempt to erase not only her past, but any possibility of a legitimate future, including agreements, inheritances, and family connections that could guarantee her safety and freedom, and that for years, she had been emotionally and financially isolated in an almost systematic way, living in a broken marriage while the imposter amassed power and control. And now, every tear shed, every night of solitude, every feeling of humiliation, was amplified by the weight of the newly discovered truth, making the moment not only painful, but transcendental, as if life itself had stopped so Emily could understand the magnitude of the manipulation she had endured. But then, something unexpected happened. Emily felt a spark of strength, an almost supernatural determination, because that truth, as devastating as it was, also gave her weapons she had never possessed before, and she realized that, for the first time, she could fight for herself without depending on someone else's justice, without waiting for anyone to rescue her story, and with that came a fierce courage, like a volcano about to erupt, burning all the pain, humiliation, and sense of helplessness, transforming them into fuel so she could face Michael, reclaim her identity, and re-establish her place in the world. And in that instant, Emily ceased to be a silent victim, becoming the protagonist of a greater, unpredictable, and overwhelming narrative. The man, seeing the change in his daughter, felt hope grow, but also fear, because he knew that facing Michael would not be simple, and that the imposter was cunning, cruel, and unpredictable. But as he looked at Emily, he saw that there was something more powerful than any manipulation, the will of someone who had known pain, rejection, and abandonment, but who now emerged determined to recover everything that had been stolen from her, and that the strength of her heart could shake the wall of lies that surrounded her life, and perhaps even bring redemption or delayed justice, not only for herself, but for everyone who had suffered because of the man who dared to deceive the entire world. And in that instant, at the top of the church steps, Emily took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and felt that, although the path ahead was uncertain, there was a new meaning to her life, a responsibility to reclaim the truth and show that even the darkest secrets could not erase the strength of a woman who had finally learned to face her own pain. And the wind that blew on that late afternoon seemed to whisper promises of justice, freedom, and self-love, as if the universe finally recognized her courage. And Emily, for the first time in many years, smiled, knowing that she was ready to take the next step toward a future where truth would be her greatest weapon, and courage her unbreakable shield. Emily felt her heart race as she walked through the silent hallway of the mansion Michael occupied, each step echoing as if the floor carried the weight of all the years of pain, abandonment, and humiliation she had endured. And upon opening the door to the main room, she found Michael seated, relaxed, as if nothing could shake his arrogance. But upon seeing her, his expression changed, and in that instant, Emily realized that the fear she had felt for years was nothing compared to the determination now burning in her veins, a force that transformed every tear shed, every night of solitude, every cruel word, into fuel for the moment that would define her destiny. And before speaking, she took a deep breath, remembering every injustice, every secret uncovered, every lie, and decided that there was no longer room for hesitation, because this was the time to reclaim her life and her identity, to confront the man who dared to manipulate not only her story, but her very heart. Michael rose slowly, a cold smile forming on his lips, but Emily did not back down. On the contrary, every step she took toward him seemed to carry years of pain concentrated into pure courage, and as she drew near, she let the truth she had discovered flow with intensity, revealing not only her inheritance, but all the crimes, manipulations, and deceptions he had committed over time. And as she spoke, her words bore the weight of silent justice, of a destiny finally revealed, because Michael, cunning as he was, had never imagined that Emily would find the strength of a heart that had suffered deeply, but was now ready to turn despair into power, and every lie he had built began to crumble under the intensity of the exposed truth. The tension in the air was almost palpable, as if the house itself held its breath before the imminent clash, and Emily continued, recounting precise details that Michael could never deny, reminding him of every broken promise, every moment of humiliation, every shadow he had cast over her life, and with every word, his face twisted, revealing a combination of anger, surprise, and fear, because the woman he had thought fragile had become relentless, and the energy radiating from her was so powerful that it seemed to transform every corner of the room, every object, every shadow, into a silent witness of her newly discovered strength. And Clara, who watched Emily from a distance, felt a shiver run down her spine, aware that this confrontation would change everything. Michael tried to interrupt, trying to minimize, manipulate, divert, but Emily remained firm, each sentence a sharp blade cutting through the facade of power he had built. And in that moment, she realized she didn't need anger, revenge, or resentment to defeat him. The truth and her courage were more powerful weapons, capable of destroying decades of lies and manipulation, and as she spoke, she felt that every word also freed herself, dissolving the fear, the doubt, and the loneliness she had carried for years, because the true strength did not lie in the humiliation she had suffered, but in the ability to transform that pain into power, and in the certainty that she was finally reclaiming her life, her story, and her dignity. The silence that followed was almost unbearable, heavy with tension and expectation, and Michael, now vulnerable, had no escape. Every defense he tried to raise was dismantled by Emily's clarity, and she realized that, as cruel as the man was, he could no longer control her destiny, nor erase the past, nor steal the future, and that moment became the synthesis of years of suffering transformed into silent justice, because Emily finally understood that the true victory was not in destroying him, but in reclaiming her own life, her identity, and her confidence in herself. And the sense of inner power was so intense that it seemed to illuminate every dark corner of the mansion, turning the place into the stage of a deserved redemption. As Michael tried to retreat, Emily revealed the last secret that would seal her power over him. documentary evidence, testimonies, messages, and proof that tied the imposter to crimes and manipulations, and that, once revealed, would make his empire of lies collapse. And with every paper presented, every fact told, Michael's stance shifted, and his arrogance fell apart, because he finally realized that the game was over, that there was no way out. And Emily, feeling the weight of justice in her hands, did not need to scream, cry, or beg. Her simple presence, firm, strong, and resolute, was enough to break the power he had exerted for years, and the sensation of vengeance and liberation mingled with a silent peace that filled every corner of her heart. Clara, moved, watched Emily turn pain into power, solitude into courage, and humiliation into victory. And in that moment she realized that the story was not just about justice, but about resilience, transformation, and redemption, because Emily had not only regained control of her life, but also inspired everyone around her to believe in the strength hidden within each one, and that even the darkest secrets can be faced with courage, determination, and truth. And the friendship between the two grew stronger, becoming an unbreakable bond, a witness to the struggle and victory that unfolded there, in that instant, where past and future collided in a single moment of light and strength. In the end, Emily took a deep breath, looking at defeated Michael and at Clara by her side, feeling that every tear, every pain, and every humiliation finally had a purpose, because she had learned that truth is unbeatable, courage is invincible, and that life, even when cruel, can be transformed into something beautiful and powerful when one faces one's own suffering. And as she left the mansion, the evening light illuminated her face with a glow of rebirth, and she knew that the journey was far from over, but that now she possessed the power to write her story, to reclaim her identity, and to live fully. And the lesson that would echo in every step was clear. Pain reveals courage, and truth is the most powerful weapon anyone can possess. Emily walked slowly through the mansion's garden, feeling the soft breeze touch her face, each breath carrying memories of years of humiliation, abandonment, and hidden secrets, but also the promise of a future that now belonged only to her. And as she looked at the flowers blooming in vivid colors, she realized that life was like those delicate petals, vulnerable yet capable of withstanding storms. And in that moment, a wave of gratitude overwhelmed her, not only for having survived, but for having found the strength to rise again. And with her heart racing and silent tears streaming down her face, she remembered every moment of pain, every cold look from Michael, every veiled betrayal, and felt that she finally understood that every scar carried a lesson, an opportunity to become stronger, more aware, and freer. And Clara, by her side, smiled through tears, recognizing the extraordinary transformation that had taken place before her eyes, because Emily had not only faced the storm, but had become the very light that pierced through it. As she walked along the stone path leading to the gate, Emily felt that the past was truly behind her, and that every step forward was an act of liberation. And yet, Michael's memory remained as a shadow, a reminder of all that had been lost, but without pain anymore, only with a clarity that nothing and no one could steal her essence or define her destiny. And upon reaching the gate, she breathed deeply, feeling the scent of freshly cut grass and the sun warming her skin. And in that moment, a sense of peace flooded her soul, because she knew that the humiliation she had suffered no longer defined her, and that every secret revealed had only been the key to unlocking the door of her own freedom. And Clara, with teary eyes, held her hand and said, with a trembling yet firm voice, that she would never forget Emily's strength. And together, they walked toward the horizon that now seemed infinitely possible. Inside the mansion, Michael remained seated, defeated and speechless, while the echoes of every secret revealed still lingered in the air, and he felt the weight of silent justice, of inescapable truth, and of the courage of a woman who dared to face years of lies with nothing but her own inner strength. And in that instant, he realized that real power did not lie in money, manipulation, or arrogance, but in the ability to face life with courage and integrity, and that no matter how much he tried to control others, he could never control someone who knew her own worth. And Michael understood too late that true triumph is the one conquered over oneself, over fear, and over the pain that shapes us, and that Emily, with every step, every word, and every act of courage, had proven that freedom is won by those who do not fear facing their own truth. The entire city seemed to breathe along with Emily when she returned to her modest apartment, feeling every detail of the life she had rebuilt. The kitchen lit by the afternoon sun, the walls that now held only good memories, the furniture she had chosen carefully, each element reflecting her own strength. And as she sat near the window, watching the children play in the street, she felt that she finally understood that happiness is not the absence of pain, but the ability to transform scars into learning, tears into courage, and memories into wisdom. And in that instant, her soul filled with a deep love for herself, because every tear she had shed, every humiliation endured, and every secret revealed had built the woman she had always been destined to be, and who finally emerged triumphant, resilient, and indestructible. The weeks that followed brought unexpected changes. Apologies from people who had underestimated her, new friendships based on respect and truth, and opportunities that once seemed impossible. And Emily realized that by confronting the past, she had opened space for an extraordinary future, and that life, though cruel at times, is generous with those who have the courage to fight. And each day, feeling more whole, more confident, and more connected to her own essence, she discovered that true wealth was not in possessions or titles, but in the freedom of being authentic, in the ability to forgive without surrendering oneself, and in the courage to keep going, even when everything seemed lost. And in every gesture, every word, and every smile, she reflected the woman who had conquered her own destiny with dignity and love. Emily finally decided to visit the places of her childhood, every street, every corner, every tree that held old memories, and as she walked through those paths, she felt that every memory, no matter how painful, now had meaning, because the pain that once had paralyzed her had turned into learning, and longing blended with gratitude. And every step was a reconciliation with herself, and upon meeting old acquaintances, she received looks of respect and admiration, and realized that transformation is not only internal, but also reflects in the world around, and that the courage to face one's own story is capable of inspiring change and awakening emotions in the hearts of those who watch, and that every act of overcoming reverberates beyond the individual, touching the lives of others with intensity and beauty, as if life itself applauded her silent triumph. At the end of the afternoon, Emily sat by the lake near the city, watching the reflection of the sky on the calm waters, and for the first time in years, she felt she could breathe without fear, that she could dream without restrictions, and that she could love without restraint. And her heart overflowed with gratitude, not only for what she had achieved, but for having survived, for having remained true to herself, and for having transformed every moment of pain into a source of strength. And in that instant, she understood that true power is not in defeating the other, but in conquering one's own doubt, and that every scar is a medal, every tear is proof of endurance, and every secret revealed is a gateway to freedom, and that life, even after traumas and humiliations, can become a masterpiece when faced with courage, truth, and self-love. The sun set slowly, painting the sky in shades of gold and red, and Emily smiled, feeling a peace she had never imagined possible, because she now knew that life would not be perfect, but it would be hers, and every choice, every step, and every act of courage belonged only to her. And as she rose and walked toward the road lit by the evening glow, she realized that true victory is to live with integrity, with love, and with courage, and that every story, even marked by pain, can find redemption, and every heart that dares to face its own shadow can emerge triumphant. And turning once more to gaze at the lake reflecting the sky, Emily murmured to herself with silent yet powerful conviction, "Pain shapes, courage transforms, and truth sets you free forever."